I was 16 when the first episode happened. I remember because it was during summer break, that perfect window of time when school feels like a distant nightmare, and the days stretch out endlessly. That night, I had stayed up way too late, mindlessly scrolling on my phone while the dull hum of cicadas filtered through my bedroom window. It was hot, one of those sticky, oppressive nights where the air felt heavier with every breath. My ceiling fan whirred lazily above me, barely doing its job. I don't know when I drifted off, but I remember the dream. It was one of those surreal ones where nothing feels quite right. I was in my own house, but everything was just off. The hallway to my room seemed longer than usual, the shadows pooling in corners deeper and more sinister. The air felt different too, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I don't remember much else except the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. When I woke up, I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling. My fan was still spinning, but the sound of the cicadas was gone. Everything was quiet, dead quiet. My body felt heavy, weighed down as though something was pressing into my chest. I tried to move, to sit up, turn my head, anything, but I couldn't. It was like my brain had disconnected from my body, leaving me trapped there, completely helpless. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the dim light in my room. A shadow, darker than the rest, hovering in the corner near my closet. My mind scrambled for explanations. A pile of clothes, maybe the chair I'd shoved in there last week. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was none of those things. It was a figure, tall and thin, its outline distorted, like static on a TV screen. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic in the silence. I wanted to scream, but my throat wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was lie there, paralyzed, as the figure began to shift. It leaned forward, its head tilting unnaturally to the side, as though it were studying me. I could make out no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a dark, rippling void where a face should have been. And then, without warning, it started moving toward me. The figure's movement wasn't natural. It didn't walk or glide. It jerked forward in fits and starts, like a marionette controlled by an unsteady hand. Each sudden motion sent a jolt of terror through me, but my body refused to respond. My chest felt like it was bound in iron, and my limbs might as well have been carved from stone. All I could do was watch as the thing came closer, the space between us shrinking inch. The air in the room changed, growing colder with every passing second. My fan still spun above me, but I couldn't feel its breeze anymore. Instead, it was like something was drawing the warmth out of the room, leeching it away until my skin prickled with goosebumps. It stopped at the foot of my bed. That awful static-like distortion rippled along its outline, and though it had no face, I could feel it staring. The weight of its attention pressed down on me, heavier than the paralysis itself. My mind raced, screaming at my body to move, to fight, to do something. And then it bent D. Its head dipped slowly, unnaturally low, until it was level with mine. Though it had no eyes, I swore I could feel its gaze boring into me, probing the deepest parts of my mind. A low sound began to hum through the room, vibrating through my bones. A deep, guttural noise that was halfway between a growl and static. I was trapped, completely helpless. But then something even worse happened. The figure reached out. Its arm stretched longer than it should have, extending toward my face with deliberate, jerky movements. The hand, if you could call it that, wasn't solid. It flickered like a bad signal, fingers shifting and breaking apart before reassembling. The closer it came, the colder the room grew, until I could see my breath in faint, wispy clouds. When it finally touched me, I expected to feel pain, or cold, or something. But the second those shadowy fingers made contact with my skin, I felt nothing at all. Instead, it was like that part of me simply ceased to exist. My cheek, my jaw, my throat. Wherever it touched, there was nothing. No sensation, no warmth, no life. The humming sound grew louder, vibrating in my skull like a swarm of bees, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I woke up, gasping. I bolted upright in bed, every muscle in my body trembling. The room was bright now, sunlight streaming through my blinds. The cicadas were back, their rhythmic drone filling the air as if nothing had happened. But I knew better, because my room was still cold. And when I looked down, I saw faint, dark smudges on my arm, like fingerprints. I stared at the smudges on my arm, my heart still hammering from the dream, or whatever that was. They weren't dirt or bruises. They were darker than my skin, almost like shadows had been pressed into my flesh. When I rubbed at them, they didn't smear or fade. They just stayed there, faint but undeniable. I told myself it had to be from something else. Maybe I'd fallen asleep on my arm, or I'd brushed up against something before I went to bed. But the excuses felt hollow, and I knew I was lying to myself. Deep down, I knew. That day passed in a fog. My parents asked if I was feeling okay. They said I looked pale. I just shrugged it off, mumbling something about staying up too late. What else could I say? That I'd woken up paralyzed while a shadowy figure loomed over me and left fingerprints on my skin? They'd think I'd lost it. By the time night rolled around, I was dreading going to bed. Normally, I'd crash around midnight, but I stayed up well past 2 a.m., scrolling on my phone with the TV on in the background. Anything to keep my mind busy. My eyes were burning from the light of the screen, but I refused to turn it off. Eventually, though, exhaustion won. I could barely keep my eyes open, and my head started nodding forward. I told myself it would be fine. It was just a bad dream. It wouldn't happen again. I turned off the TV, plugged in my phone, and climbed into bed. I left the bedside lamp on this time, its warm glow spilling across my room. For some reason, the thought of total darkness made my stomach twist. I drifted off quickly, my body sinking into the mattress like it had been waiting for sleep all day. But it didn't feel restful. I was back in my house again, but it wasn't quite right, just like the night before. The walls seemed to lean inward, and the air felt thick, heavy. I was walking down the hallway this time, each step echoing unnaturally loud, and every door I passed was cracked open just enough for darkness to spill out. I stopped at my bedroom door. It was shut tight. That's when I heard it. A low scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It was coming from inside my room. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to wake myself up if I could. But something else, a pull, a pressure, urged me forward. When I turned the knob, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I pushed the door open, and there it was, standing at the foot of my bed, the same shadowy figure from the night before. Only this time it wasn't still. It was waiting for me. The figure turned its head toward me as the door creaked open, its movements jerky and wrong, like a broken puppet suddenly coming to life. I froze in the doorway, unable to look away from it. The way it stood there, its tall, spindly frame distorted and shimmering, made my stomach churn. The room felt alive. The air thrummed with a low vibration, just on the edge of hearing. It was like the very walls were holding their breath, waiting to see what I'd do. The figure took a step forward, and I stumbled back instinctively. My foot caught on something. I don't even remember what, and I fell hard, landing on the carpet with a thud that sent a sharp jolt through my body. But I couldn't feel the pain. I couldn't feel anything except cold dread. The figure didn't stop. It took another step, its long limbs twitching unnaturally, and the closer it got, the more the room seemed to stretch and shift around it. The walls seemed farther away now, and the light from the lamp dimmed until it was barely a flicker. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, not with words. The sound that filled my head was indescribable, like static, mixed with whispers and something sharp, like glass breaking. But somehow I understood, said my name. Hearing it made my stomach drop. There was something intimate about the way it said it, like it had known me for a long time, like it had been waiting for this moment. I scrambled backward on the floor, desperate to get away, but my body felt sluggish, heavy. It was like the air around me had turned to molasses. My hands scraped against the carpet as I tried to push myself up, but no matter how hard I fought, I couldn't gain any distance. The figure tilted its head, as if amused, and then its long, shadowy arm reached out. I shut my eyes tight, bracing for the same numb, void-like sensation I'd felt the night before. But instead, I felt something warm. Not on my skin, inside me. It felt like fire blooming in my chest, spreading out in jagged lines through my veins. My head snapped back, and a sound escaped my lips. A guttural, strangled cry I didn't recognize as my own. I opened my eyes, and suddenly I was awake. I was back in bed, the lamp still on, my blankets tangled around me. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. For a moment, I thought it was over, just another nightmare. But then I noticed the shadows. They were wrong. Every corner of my room seemed darker than it should have been, the shadows unnaturally deep. And then I realized one of them was moving. The shadow in the corner didn't belong. It was darker than anything I'd ever seen, like it had been cut out of reality itself. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but then it shifted slowly, deliberately, as though it knew I was watching. Every hair on my body stood on end. My instinct screamed at me to bolt, to throw myself out of bed and run. But something deeper, something primal, kept me frozen. I felt like prey caught in the predator's sights. It began to move toward me, not with the jerky, puppet-like movements of before, but with smooth, fluid precision. The shadows around it seemed to ripple and bend, pulling toward it like it was sucking the darkness out of the room. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked tight. My breathing came in short, shallow gasps, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I clutched the edge of my blanket like a lifeline, but it felt utterly useless, like a paper shield against a storm. The figure stopped at the foot of my bed. For a moment, it simply stood there, towering over me. Its form was more solid now, less like static and more like an actual being. I still couldn't make out any features. Its face was nothing but an endless void, but I could feel its focus on me. And then it did something I wasn't expecting. Crouched down. Its body folded in on itself with an unsettling grace, limbs bending and twisting in ways that made my stomach lurch. It leaned closer, its head dipping just low enough that I could feel its presence inches from my face. The air around me grew colder, until my breath came out in trembling clouds. I wanted to close my eyes, to block it out, but I couldn't. It was like its gaze held me in place, forcing me to stare into that empty void where its face should have been. Then, without warning, it whispered. The sound wasn't like before. It wasn't static or whispers or glass. It was something worse. A low, guttural murmur that seemed to crawl into my ears and burrow deep into my brain. I couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. It was a warning, or maybe a threat, and just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The shadows receded, the room brightened, and the air warmed. I sat up, gasping for breath, my body trembling so hard I could barely keep myself upright. My head throbbed, and my chest ached, like I just run a marathon. But the worst part was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, like the room was holding its breath again, waiting for something. I glanced around, searching for any sign of the figure, but it was as if it had never been there. That's when I noticed my closet door. It was open, just a crack. My closet door was always shut. Always. I had a weird habit of double-checking it before I went to bed, and I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it that night. But there it was, just barely open, a sliver of darkness spilling into the room. I sat frozen in my bed, staring at the door like it might move on its own. My breathing was shallow, my chest still tight from the lingering panic. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd probably left it like that earlier and hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew better. I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed, not with the memory of that figure still fresh in my mind. The way it had leaned in, whispered to me. It felt like its presence was still lingering in the room, just out of sight. I pulled my knees to my chest and sat there, the glow of my bedside lamp doing little to chase away the oppressive darkness pressing in around me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I wasn't sure anymore. The clock on my nightstand said it was just after 4 a.m., but time didn't feel real at that moment. All I could focus on was the crack in the closet door and the suffocating weight of the silence. And then I heard it. The faint sound, so soft I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. It came from the closet, a barely audible shuffle, like fabric brushing against wood. My heart lurched, and my grip on the blanket tightened until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to tell myself it was just my clothes shifting on their hangers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there, watching, waiting. The air felt colder again, and I realized I could see my breath, faint and wispy in the dim light. My entire body was trembling, but I forced myself to move. Slowly, cautiously, I leaned over to grab my phone from the nightstand. The screen lit up, momentarily blinding me in the darkness. I opened the flashlight app, the pale beam of light cutting through the shadows as I aimed it at the closet door. My hand was shaking so badly that the beam wobbled, casting eerie shapes across the walls. The door didn't move. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the lump in my throat. My mind was racing, a constant loop of fear and doubt. Was this all in my head? Another nightmare? Or was I awake and completely, utterly screwed? I wanted to call out, to demand that whatever was in there show itself, but the words died in my throat. The fear of hearing a response, or worse, not hearing one at all, was too much. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I shone the flashlight directly at the crack in the door. The light barely penetrated the darkness inside, but for a split second, I thought I saw something. Eyes, two faint pinpricks of light, glinting deep within the shadows. I dropped my phone. The flashlight beam swung wildly before landing face down on the floor, plunging the room back into a dim, trembling glow from my lamp. I scrambled to grab the phone, my hands fumbling as panic overtook me. When I looked back at the closet, the door was open wider. The closet door was now open just enough for a person to step out. The crack of darkness had widened into a yawning void, and I was certain, absolutely certain, that whatever had been inside was now closer to me. My phone was still in my hand, the flashlight app open but pointed uselessly at the ceiling. I couldn't bring myself to shine it at the closet again. My gut told me I wouldn't like what I'd see. The silence pressed in around me, so heavy it felt like it was seeping into my skin. Even the familiar buzz of the cicadas outside had disappeared, leaving the world eerily still. My breathing was shallow, each gasp a struggle against the suffocating tension in the room. And then I heard the sound again. A shuffle. Faint, but distinct. This time it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from under the bed. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My mind flashed back to when I was a kid, terrified of the idea that something might be hiding under there. I'd always told myself it was just an irrational fear, one I'd grown out of. But now, faced with the impossible, that fear came roaring back, stronger than ever. I gripped my phone tighter, using it as a flimsy anchor against the panic threatening to consume me. I thought about turning the flashlight toward the floor, about looking under the bed and confirming what I already knew. But I couldn't. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, my muscles locked in place as though moving would somehow make it worse. The seconds stretched into eternity, each one marked by the pounding of my heart. And then I felt it, a light pressure against the mattress near my feet. It was subtle at first, almost like the weight of a hand. Then it grew heavier, deliberate, as though someone or something was climbing onto the bed. My breath hitched, and my vision blurred with tears. I wanted to scream, to leap off the bed and bolt for the door, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was clutch my phone and pray that I was still dreaming. The weight shifted, creeping up the mattress inch by inch. I could feel it now, the faintest dip in the bed, the way the blankets pulled taut around my legs. And then it stopped, right beside me. My body was trembling so violently that I thought I might collapse in on myself. The air around me was ice cold, and the faint smell of something acrid, like burnt plastic, stung my nostrils. I didn't dare look, but I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of something brushing against my arm. The touch was light at first, like a faint graze of fingertips. But it wasn't warm. It wasn't even cold. It was nothing, an absence of sensation, like the very concept of touch had been hollowed out. I could feel tears streaking down my face, hot against my frozen cheeks. My lips trembled as I tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but no sound came out. The pressure against my arm grew heavier, more deliberate, as though whatever was beside me was trying to make its presence known. My eyes stayed locked on the ceiling. I didn't dare look. Then I heard the breathing. It wasn't my own, it couldn't be. My breath was shallow and ragged, barely making it past the lump in my throat. But this sound was steady, rhythmic, and impossibly close. Each inhale dragged in with a wet, rattling noise, and the exhale was worse. A low, gurgling rasp that sent shivers through every nerve in my body. It was right next to my ear. I clutched the phone tighter, its faint glow illuminating nothing but the trembling outline of my hand. My thumb hovered over the screen, desperate to do something, anything, but I didn't know what. Call someone? Shine the light? The options felt meaningless. The breathing continued, each exhale like a whisper against my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut, my body stiff with terror. My mind was screaming, pleading for it to stop. And then it did. The silence that followed was worse. For a moment, nothing happened. No breathing, no movement, just the deafening stillness that made every second feel like an eternity. I held my breath, my pulse hammering in my ears, and for one brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over. But then I felt the weight shift again. It moved slowly, deliberately, sliding across the mattress toward my head. The blankets tugged slightly against my body as whatever it was crawled closer. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of something brushing my hair. My stomach twisted, and bile rose in my throat. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to throw myself out of bed, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, every muscle locked in place as the thing beside me grew bolder. And then it spoke. This time it wasn't a whisper or a guttural murmur. It was clear, deliberate, and unmistakably human. "Why won't you look at me?" The voice was soft, almost childlike, but there was something wrong about it. The words dragged, as though it struggled to form them, and each syllable felt like it was crawling under my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, tears streaming down my face. I wouldn't look, couldn't, but the voice came again, this time louder. "Look at me." The words echoed in my skull, sharp and insistent, and I felt my resolve cracking. My hands trembled as I clutched the blankets, trying to ground myself, to keep from giving in. And then I made the mistake of opening my eyes. I didn't want to, but it was like my body betrayed me. My eyes opened slowly, trembling with the weight of fear. The first thing I saw was the ceiling, dimly lit by the soft glow of my lamp. For one fleeting second, I thought maybe I was imagining it all, that nothing would be there. But then I turned my head. It was right there, inches from my face. The thing was crouched on the bed, its long skeletal limbs twisted and bent at impossible angles. Its body seemed to pulse, as though it wasn't entirely solid, like it was barely clinging to this world. The faint ripples of static still flickered across its frame, but now it looked more defined, more real. And its face, oh God, its face. It wasn't a face at all. It was a void, an endless blackness that seemed to devour the light around it. But the longer I stared, the more I thought I could see something moving within it. Shapes twisted and coiled in the darkness, too fast and too alien to comprehend. Couldn't look away. Its presence was overpowering, suffocating, like it was pulling me into that endless void. My breath caught in my throat as the thing tilted its head, studying me with an unnatural curiosity. "You see me now?" it whispered, its voice like a hiss of wind through broken glass. I couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. My body felt like it was no longer mine, like the thing had stripped away my will and left me completely vulnerable. It moved closer, its body folding and unfolding in unnatural ways. Its hand, or what I assumed was a hand, reached out again, the fingers impossibly long and sharp, more like claws than flesh. I wanted to pull away, to scream, but my body stayed frozen, paralyzed by fear and whatever power this thing held over me. When its clawed fingers touched my chest, I felt that same void-like numbness as before. But this time it went deeper. It wasn't just my skin. I could feel it reaching into me, pulling at something I couldn't quite name. And then I realized it wasn't just touching me. It was taking something. A wave of cold swept through me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper, more profound, like the very essence of who I was being drained away. Memories flashed in my mind. Images of my family, my friends, moments from my childhood, blurring and fading as if they were being pulled out of me. I tried to fight it, to hold on to those pieces of myself, but the harder I fought, the more the thing seemed to revel in it. "You belong to me now," it said, its voice reverberating through my skull. My vision began to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges. My body grew heavier, and the world around me started to dissolve into nothingness. I thought this was it, that I was about to disappear completely. But then, something changed. The lamp beside my bed flickered violently, its weak glow flaring brighter and brighter until it filled the entire room. The thing recoiled, its form distorting and twisting as if the light was burning it. "No," it hissed, its voice cracking with rage. The pressure on my chest lifted, and I gasped for air, my lungs heaving as I scrambled backward. The thing writhed, its shadowy form shrinking and contorting as the light grew more intense. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, it was gone. The room was silent again, the air still heavy with the lingering chill. I sat there, shaking, staring at the empty space where the thing had been. My lamp was still flickering, its light dimming until the room was bathed in soft, golden warmth once more. I was alive, but I knew it wasn't over. For a long time I didn't move. I sat there on the edge of my bed, staring into the shadows, half expecting the thing to reappear. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst, and my breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. The room was warm again, but I couldn't shake the cold that seemed to linger deep in my chest. I finally forced myself to get up, my legs trembling so badly that I nearly collapsed. My phone was still clutched in my hand, the flashlight app glowing dimly against the floor. I turned it off and set the phone on my nightstand, my movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden motion might bring the thing back. The closet door was still open. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my hands balled into fists at my sides. I told myself it was just a door, just wood and hinges and shadows. But deep down I knew better. That thing had come from somewhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the closet was a gateway. A thin, fragile barrier between my world and something far worse. I grabbed the door and slammed it shut, my fingers gripping the handle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then I shoved my desk chair in front of it for good measure, as if that would somehow keep the thing out. But I knew it wouldn't. The rest of the night passed in a haze. I didn't sleep. I didn't even turn off the lamp. I just sat there on my bed, knees pulled to my chest, staring at the shadows and waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning finally came, the first rays of sunlight creeping through the blinds, I felt a faint flicker of relief. The thing hadn't come back. Maybe it couldn't survive in the light. I went through the motions of the day in a daze. My parents noticed, of course. They asked if I was sick, if I wanted to stay home. I shook my head and told them I was fine, though my voice was hollow and unconvincing. I didn't know how to explain what had happened to me. I didn't even understand it myself. The smudges on my arm were still there, fainter now but still visible if you looked closely. I wore a long-sleeved shirt to cover them, but every time I looked down, I felt their weight, like a brand, a reminder that I wasn't safe. That night, I debated whether to sleep in my room or on the couch downstairs. The thought of going back into that room, of lying in that bed, made my skin crawl. But some part of me, stubborn or stupid, refused to let the thing win. So I stayed. I kept the lamp on, of course. I double-checked the closet door, making sure it was still blocked by the chair. Then I climbed into bed, my muscles tense and ready to spring at the slightest sound. I didn't fall asleep right away. For hours, I lay there, listening to every creak of the house, every rustle of the trees outside. But eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke up, the lamp was off, the chair was tipped over, and the closet door was wide open. My phone was on the floor, the screen cracked, the flashlight app glowing faintly. And in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the faint light, the shadow was waiting. It hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been patient.